What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Now, I look at this video not only as a record of decks that are elite, but also as a record of what is happening in the metagame right now. And I think no deck exemplifies what is happening in the metagame right now more so than this. And I realize that this sort of still looks like your various types of tech pile decks. There's still a Shang in here, there's still an Ench, there's still a Zabu, there's still a Surge. But what this deck represents to me is the way the top of the metagame is shifting against the hard tech decks. This is a deck with 2 tech cards. This is not a deck with 5 tech cards. And the reason this deck works is because it is a deck that manages to invalidate most of the other tech cards, which means that in matchups against Sera decks, it's just going to have more points if things are working properly for it. What I've really enjoyed about this deck is the power it can bring without actually giving up the extremely meaningful tech cards. This is a deck that puts a lot of points on the board. It has a very solid and straightforward method of gameplay, and I think people will enjoy playing America Chavez in Fastos in an actually good deck. It also bears mentioning that even though I did go like 18-8 with this deck, I still think there's probably room to improve, especially with a card like Mr. Fantastic First Steps dropping in just a bit. I think this deck sort of exemplifies the shift at the top of the metagame away from hard control and towards a splash of control with large points in it in a way that helps you beat the control decks. Another example of this trend is the Victoria hand deck, which takes it even further by playing almost no actual tech in here and is instead focused on using its points as removal and dodging as much of the tech as it possibly can. In this way, Juggernaut is an incredibly important card in this list because otherwise you are very vulnerable to things like Enchantress on your Moonstones. Doing things like that is a little bit awkward, and this also has a notable weakness to Invisible Woman Killmonger, and you have to play priority against really any deck that does have Killmonger, but the upside is your point potential is much better than in the average Sera deck or hard control deck with all of the tech cards is going to be able to match. Same vibe here, except we are just a little bit less vulnerable to Killmonger. Now, it might be a little bit surprising to hear me call a Quinjet deck less vulnerable to Killmonger, but the reason for that is that you're gonna be getting your Quinjet value because anyone who really knows what they're doing against this deck is holding Killmonger for turn 6 to try to hit your demons. So they're not really gonna be blowing up your Quinjet, and what you're gonna be doing is using Quinjet to discount other cards like Ultron Stones, for example, to a demon level of size and cost without actually having the vulnerability to Killmonger. This deck also has a lot bigger range on the final turns of the game because of the Infinity Ultron, which means that it's just harder to play against. But you can see the same trend happening. People are moving away from hard tech, hard control decks. Not that they're still not good, but this is sort of what the reaction to them looks like. If you'll pardon the boomer analogy, it's very similar to like when Silky Smooth was a good deck. It was a good deck almost entirely on the back of being the deck that dodged Shang-Chi the best while also using Shang-Chi. And that's sort of what the first deck we talked about is. These decks are still doing the same type of thing. What we're trying to do here is invalidate as many of the tech cards as we possibly can through tight play and clever deck building so that we just have positive matchups into whatever tech soup people feel like bringing to ladder. Speaking of tech soup, Invisisera is still my preferred version of it. I just find that this deck has so many decent matchups. As much as I've talked about how it can be a little bit awkward when people have just the ability to put more points down than you, this deck has a shocking amount of points for a deck that does not invest in points in any meaningful way. Just a genuinely shocking amount of points. It is actually kind of horrifying how good a Sera into after, say, a Gwenpooled Mysterio and Hitmonkey can be. You have all of this amazing stuff. If one tech card is relevant, your Mysterio and Hitmonkey are probably going to handle the entire rest of the game. It's just such an advantageous position to be in. Now, downsides, you can absolutely get rolled by Mobius M. Mobius, and you can absolutely get rolled if your Gwenpool isn't actually hitting your Mysterio. Your points are heavily impacted when that doesn't happen, but In most matchups, you're still going to be able to fall back on tech, and to me, this is the deck that is the best at using that tech. The ability to do so in the context of having Invisible Woman means that you have ultimate control over priority. I've seen people ask, why do you not play Ghost in here? The largest reason is that Invisible Woman is just better because you do not have to play her earlier. You can hold Invisible Woman Killmonger, and people will snap into you with their move bounce deck and a 40 power Human Torch. You can just do that. Like, it's the kind of thing that will farm 8 cubers, and it is a genuinely monstrous thing to bring to bear. This, for me, is why Serra Invisible Woman is the best of the tech soup decks. If you're looking for a tech soup deck with just a monstrously high floor, I think the Shamo build of the soup is perfectly acceptable. This is just your classic mid-range soup, points and removal in as an efficient a package as you can possibly get. I do sort of wonder if it's been a little bit outclassed by the first deck we showed today, if that deck is just doing this but a little bit stronger. But what this deck does bring to bear is Mobius and Killmonger, which are very relevant across a wide variety of different matchups and can prevent things from getting too out of control and bring your opponents back down to earth. This is just a compelling group of cards. Nothing in here is weak. Everything in here is going to be relevant in one way or another, and Merlin sort of glues it all together by just making sure that your stuff that isn't relevant either gives you extra energy or turns into a bigger body or gives you extra energy on his own to allow you to play a Serra-style final turn. All of that stuff is just very straightforwardly happening. It's just very strong. I have greatly enjoyed the Iris build of Serra, which I highlighted just yesterday, or a few days ago, actually. I really like playing this deck. It's just been very good for me. It has a bunch of really confusing mix-ups, but it is incredibly difficult to play. I will say that for sure. This is a deck that has reliance on Merlin spells to turn on your Miss Marvel sometimes. Your positioning matters a ton. There's a ton of 2s in here. You can really screw yourself over with where you put your Serra, with where you put your Miss Marvel, with where you put your Klaw, with what you allow your opponent to see. There is so much here. But fundamentally, the baseline principle of this deck, which is there are going to be games where you get 3 Miss Marvels in the middle and add 15 points to the 2 side lanes on the final turn of the game, and that costs you 4 energy. It's just really damn strong. This deck wants to get Serra out on 4, play the Ancient one on 5, or if failing that, play the Ancient one on 3 and Serra on 5, and then make sure that you have a massive duplication of power. This is a deck that I think, I like Klaw. I like Klaw a lot. If I could run a second Miss Marvel, I would run a second Miss Marvel. And a lot of that is just Klaw only goes one way. It's really that, it's that straightforward. If I had access to a second smaller Miss Marvel, even Mr. Fantastic would honestly make a reasonable case for existing. He's just a little too small, but having something like Split Klaw would go a long way. And I don't think that's Omega Red. I don't think we're in the Omega Red business, but it is just something that really sticks out to me about just how mediocre Klaw is compared to Miss Marvel. She is definitely the star of what this deck is trying to do. This deck has just been straight up good for a month, and I don't think a single thing about it has changed. This is a very solid combination of surprise, of points, of tech. You are never out of any game. You are very often going to have what you need in order to interact with people. This is the build that I prefer. I know that I recently covered in a video the Professor X build of this. I still think the original build is a little bit superior. This sort of Annihilus stuff is strong enough that you are very interested in it. It is what I would be doing with Agamotto right now, and I am actually relatively impressed with Agamotto's longevity because I sort of saw him as a card that might fall off, and he has succeeded and stuck around in this metagame to the point that he is, in my view, just a genuine metagame staple. He just has been so good for so long and so consistently able to up the ceiling of these decks that don't succeed nearly as much without his ability to create massive surprising power spikes with images of Icon, or to displace things, or to create extra energy, or really all of his spells, basically. They're all good, they all add to what this deck is trying to do, and they all make it so that this is a very powerful mid-range deck in the current metagame, even though it is far lighter on tech than some of the other hard control decks. Batroc midrange is doing its level best to recreate Silky Smooth. You have exactly a Shang-Chi, which means there are 100% going to be combo decks that just clap you. If you run into Kid Omega Nimrod, you're not beating it. Like, you do not beat Kid Omega Shuri Nimrod. I'm not fully convinced you beat Kid Omega Galacta Nimrod. You probably don't. And so this is one of those decks where your matchup spread is like very stark. You don't beat a Mr. Negative draw. You don't beat a good Nimrod draw. There are decks where you are just instantly out of it because you do not have the interaction suite of the hard control decks. But against those hard control decks, you get to sort of be the out mid-range deck. You are a deck that does not have a lot of things that are going to reasonably be hit by their tech cards. Now, the popularity of Shadow King is notable for you because of how much green power is in this deck, but you should be able to, with good play, dodge a Shang-Chi. You do need to keep in mind that if you are relying on Batroc, Killmonger is always a thing that can get you. And I think largely the fact that this deck dodges most, but not all of the tech, is the one thing that's really holding it back. The fact that you're still gonna get got by Killmonger Fenris Wolf, or a really big Shadow King. Like, that stuff, the ethos for this deck to exist is that none of that happens to you. And so you really need to have those matchups be good because your combo matchups are abysmal. If your opponent's combo deck does not die to Shang-Chi, you get comboed on and you are not going to be able to recover from that. I feel like people are sleeping on this, and I'm not really sure why. Like, I think it is just still a very, very good deck. I have thought for a while that it's just a very, very good deck. Like, I haven't changed a single card. Every time I mess around with anything else in this sort of shell, I just come back to this. And like, yes, Gladiator sells games horrifically. Don't get me started on that guy. But I just keep coming back, and it's like, you know what? It's always fine. It's always just a perfectly good deck that is actively going to help you succeed. It just does such strong stuff. Cannonball Mercury, blow something up, Fenris Wolf it back. All of that kind of stuff is just absolutely awesome. Mercury, by the way, is just a great card. Like, I really cannot say enough good things about Mercury. There are people playing Move Bounce. There are people playing Normal Move. There are people playing Werewolf by Night. And there are sometimes locations that things can't get into. Like, she is just absolutely a star. If anything is hurting Jeff's viability in the current metagame, it is the fact that Mercury exists, and I think I would rather play her almost every single time. This deck is in a very similar spot to the Scream deck, where if you are able to properly dodge the tech and manage what you're trying to do, you should be in most games you play. Unless those games are against combo decks, in which case you are absolutely out of those games. This is a deck that cannot beat a Mr. Negative in a million years. It is all in on using its Afflict as interaction, but it's probably not beating a Nimrod if you're gonna get any kind of buff onto that Nimrod either. It can happen. Like, there are Diamondback things that can go really well with a Hazmat, putting that Nimrod down to 3 instead of 6, but you kind of need them to, like, not have buffed it at all as well. There's just a lot that can make you feel stupid for queuing a deck with this level of interaction. And when I say this level of interaction, I mean no interaction, roughly. Like, you have stuff, but you don't have tech. And that means that you just sort of walk out there naked. And if someone decides that they're going to take a swing at you by, like, playing a Mr. Negative on turn 3, they got you. Eggy's Move deck has been skyrocketing in popularity. I personally am not the biggest fan of it because I think once people grasp what's going on, it's a lot easier to beat. But right now, it's getting a lot of equity, in my opinion, from people thinking that it's Move Bounce and playing subtly differently, like holding a Killmonger instead of just using it because they're not actually going to bounce stuff. And the fact that the early game looks so similar to Move Bounce, but there are these like subtle differences in how you're supposed to play against it is really legitimately impactful. This is also just a deck that is nigh impossible to predict. You have your final turn come down to a 50-50 basically all of the time. It's like, am I going to play the Heimdall or am I not going to play the Heimdall? You also have this Hulkling in here, which adds just an additional amount of who the hell knows what's actually happening in this game. Baseline, I will play a 6-12, and then everything you did because you played to beat my Heimdall goes out the water. So I think this deck gets better the more your opponents are aware of the possibilities, but also it gets a little bit worse when they're aware of what this deck actually is. It's kind of an interesting trade-off. But I do think that fundamentally, you're basically never below 50% against the mid-range decks because you're always going to have a play that wins the game. And similarly, though, playing against this deck as the mid-range deck, you're going to find yourself kicking yourself a lot because you're going to have to make a perfect read. And if you make that perfect read, you will beat this deck. But you have to actually make the read. And it is quite difficult to make that read. Like, it is hard. You will put Shang-Chi's in the wrong lanes and you will get got. That's how it goes. Almost exactly the same vibe here with the Red Wing thing. It's just instead of using scaling movers for the most part, this is just some big guys. Again, definite Shang-Chi vulnerability, but the moves should help keep it relatively safe. I would compare this fairly reasonably to like a Denish Hela style deck when this metagame is the way it is, which such a sort of downward pressure on it from all of the tech decks preventing anything from going too insane a lot of the time, you end up with decks like this that can be successful because of the downward pressure applied. This deck will feast on sort of small mid-range decks without interaction. Afflict is not beating the Infinite basically any of the time. Yeah, Ajax in theory, but like, let's be real about it. It exists in sort of the same realm as Nightmare, but I think it does its job just a little bit better at the current moment. Both of them are decks where it's like, what if I just had 20 power? I think this is sort of my preferred version of the what if I just had 20 power deck. Or this, you know, Denish Hela, never going to be upset to see a Denish Hela, except every time I actually have to play against it. The deck is still what it is. This is a deck that does Hela things, but it synergizes in a world where it also does ramp things. You can brick some, it definitely can happen. The Supergiant here is pretty cool because it really messes up like Sarah control type stuff, which is already a pretty good matchup, but with the Invisible Woman gets a little bit dicier. So this allows you to like hard win that, but it also lets you hide your big guys from interaction, right? Like you can, if you have a Corvus Glaive, you can then play Supergiant and put something really big down that can't be Shang-Chi'd. And that's kind of something you're really interested in doing a lot of the time. You just put a guy on there and he will not be Shang-Chi'able. You care a lot about that, especially if you're hampering their points output by preventing a Sarah. This is a deck that has a lot of tricks to it, don't get me wrong. There are things that this deck can do, i.e. getting a Gambit and a Hela in the same lane and then auditing that lane. There's just a bunch of really strong stuff that this deck can bring to bear, a lot of unique interactions, and I think it's shown itself to be a high-level competitor for sure. I think we all know what Mr. Negative is trying to do at this point. I'm not really sure how much time I need to spend on this. You play Mr. Negative, you draw your cards, you win the game. Your point output is bigger than every other deck. If you get Mobius, you absolutely die. That was Mr. Negative in 5 seconds. I honestly think that's kind of all you need to know. Move Bounce is still good, but it took a beating from Invisible Woman Sarah being a viable part of this metagame. This is a deck that thrives when it is able to meaningfully throw priority, and it should, in theory, beat a lot of these tech soup decks. It does not beat Invisible Woman Killmonger. It does not beat Invisible Woman and Shadow King. It does not beat any of that crap. It will lose. And just that one matchup has done enough to damage this deck that I think that it has legitimately fallen down, and that is part of why the other version of the move deck is actually going to be there, because it's always putting those decks in 50-50s, whereas this deck, if they have the Invisible Woman, you're just getting blown out. If you invested in a Human Torch, you're probably getting blown out anyway. And it's just a very, very, very hard spot for the deck to be in my opinion. I want y'all to know how close I was to putting the Khonshu Dracula version of this on here. I really, really do. And a lot of it is a little bit down to that Sarah stuff again. There are more decks doing Invisible Woman stuff right now. I know this sounds ridiculous. Then there are Red Guardianing you. And so the Dracula stuff just like gets a little better because of that. I do think that this deck is still the way I would want to play discard, but it does have some noticeably obnoxious matchups into the sort of meta tyrant stuff where it's running enough tech cards that you just sort of incidentally get got by a bunch of them in combination. Like the Shamo deck, right? Like, oh, they have Enchantress for my Morbius, not Mobius, but they have a Mobius for my Swarms. Just a bunch of stuff, right? Like a bunch of just possible things can happen to you. A Killmonger on my Meek that I really care about. And you can super pop off. And I also think that like in the pseudo mirror, you're probably a little bit advantaged based on the scalers that you can have access to with a Dakin. This is a consistent and powerful deck that I have a lot of respect for. I've actually seen people putting a Mobius in here just to really dagger the Serra players. I don't know if that makes sense per se, but it is really funny, and I did totally lose to it. This is going to sound weird, but I think both C2 and C3 are like actively good right now. I actually, for once in ever, kind of think C3 might be better. And that's really down to the difference in animals. C2 protects its Cerebro with a Goose. C3 protects its Cerebro with a Cosmo, which is just a much harder layer of protection to get through. This is just a very, very hard no, whereas C2 is sort of a soft no. And it's a soft no that a lot of discounty decks can get around. Oh, nice Goose. Too bad my Enchantress cost 2 because I surged it and then also had a Serra, right? Like that kind of stuff makes me lean more towards C3. And the fact that the ceiling of this metagame in terms of points is actually lower also makes me lean a little towards C3. I still have C2 on here because I think it's sort of the more generically applicable version, but I think if I had to choose one to play at the highest level of Infinite right now, I would actually maybe go C3, and it's probably the first time I can reasonably say that since Cerebro got buffed. This deck kind of sucks, but it really stat checks people. Like, to me, this occupies a space kind of where Phoenix Force used to occupy, where it's just like, okay, look, yes, the deck is gonna fall apart some of the time. 100%. The deck can be vulnerable to various things. But when you just like do Shuri Nimrod Kid Omega, there's very little that can actually do anything about what you're doing. It is just like, oh, GG, dude, we both teams played hard. It's over. It's actually over. Like it's just not a play line that people are packing the correct interaction for, and I don't even know what the correct interaction would be. The fact that he pops it on turn 5 means that like it's like, oh, I'm supposed to armor Cosmo. It's like you don't even know where it's gonna be. There's just so much going on here. It did get hurt by the Galacta nerf. That actually legitimately matters in a non-zero amount of games. But it didn't get hurt enough to disappear, in large part because, as we discussed, the point ceiling of this metagame is being sort of depressed by the amount of tech cards in it. And this deck just sort of, A, very good against a lot of the tech cards, B, just really good in terms of the points it puts out. I might be alone on Thanos 10's Island, but I straight up think that this is like if a Nightmare deck was good. And I'm not saying you can't win games with Nightmare decks, but this is like if one of them was actually good. I know that I'm kind of clowning Nightmare here, and that's not what I want to be doing. Like, yeah, it's a fine deck. You can play it. It's definitely not a snap condition. And I'm actually really happy to report that people have learned that. There are so many fewer Nightmare snaps now. I'm like, that should actually probably make the deck stats better, honestly. But this is like if a Nightmare deck could play Armor and Cosmo. Like, that's what it is. That's what's going on here. I've seen some other movement in Thanos. I think maybe ongoing Thanos is a little bit underlooked at. Definitely a cool thing to do. But I am very, very, very compelled by this deck currently. I just think it's good. They can't Shang you everywhere. And if they try to be a tech deck, you have really powerful priority tools. All of these tech decks are throwing priority. Final turn, big guy, and a thing that stops their interaction. It's just good. I know. It's been a while since we ended a tier list with Destroy. Dormammu has come out and moved Destroy all the way from the end of the tier list to the end of the tier list. Shout out to Dormammu. Thank you so much for doing all that you have done to make Destroy quasi-playable. It is actually quasi-playable. I'm thinking about buying a Bucky Barnes Ultimate variant. Am I stupid? Yes, extremely. Am I a Dormammu coper? Yes, extremely. Is it actually kind of playable? Yeah, it is. It's like legitimately kind of decent. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Best of luck on the ladder, and I will see you in the next one.